Hi, I'm Dr. John Raacke. I am a psychologist here at Fort Hays State University. I am currently the chair of the Justice Studies Department. In previous life, I was a cognitive psychologist. I guess technically I still am a cognitive psychologist, but I am here today to talk to you about IO psychology, which might seem as a very big disconnect between the type of psychologist I am. Rest assured, I do know what I'm talking about. About half of my work is in IO psychology from my PhD graduate school work. As far as what IO psychologists do, I do have a pretty good insight. I've done some research with IO psychologists, so I wanted to kind of talk to you today about what they are and kind of the work that they do so that you can be more familiar with the things that they do within the field of psychology. IO psychologists, by and large, are there to study workplaces. They look at the workplaces, people in workplaces, whether it be the employees, the management, anything that has to do with a workplace setting or a business type setting. If you've ever seen the movie Office Space, a lot of people have, some people have, it's kind of an older movie in the 90s. There's a scene in the movie Office Space where you have these consultants come in named the Bobs. Well, the Bobs are what we would consider IO psychologists. IO psychologists oftentimes do come into businesses and, for lack of a better term, take out the management and reorganize and help businesses work better, become more efficient, and ensure that their workers are not only happy but productive in what they do. So again, it's the business side of psychology. A lot of IO psychologists work in business schools. They don't actually work in psychology departments. They work in business schools. They work for businesses as large as Johnson & Johnson, Cisco, SAS, you name it, and as small as any other types of corporations that consult. If you want to do IO psychology, there's some certain kind of coursework that you might want to consider. Again, psychology at its core is all about study of behavior, attitudes, opinions, mental thoughts, how they relate to what you do in the real world. So the principles are the same, but the IO psychologists take all those principles and apply them to the business world. IO psychologists specialize in things like leadership, motivation, job satisfaction, worker satisfaction. They also work with training, human resources departments to identify those individuals who are skilled and take their particular talents and try to show other people how to do their job better. The IO psychologists are really what you would consider the rock stars of psychology, which is kind of a funny term when you think about a psychologist. We often think psychologists are clinicians. When you hear about it as freshmen, you think, oh, you lay on a couch and you listen to people's problems. Well, personally, I have my own issues, so I've never been a big fan of listening to other people's issues. But IO psychologists are almost the complete opposite when it comes to that. They're that other side of psychology, the other 50% who do the research. And I know what you're thinking. Research, why would I want to do research? What's the fun behind that? But research is actually very interesting. IO psychologists are the highest paid group of psychologists in psychology. They are highly paid. They are hard to get on staff at academic universities because we just can't afford to pay them. Most universities out there have to pay their IO psychologists quite a bit more than they do, say, their clinicians, their cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, or whatever other types you've learned about so far. I like to tell, when I do this in classes, I like to tell a story. I had a friend of mine in graduate school who got his master's degree in IO psychology. He was going to get his PhD, but he got a call from Compaq. Compaq was located in Houston. This was back in the early part of 2000. Compaq's located down in Houston. He got a call and got offered a job. They offered him $120,000 a year, bought him a house, and gave him a company car with a master's degree, which is kind of surprising. Most people, when you think of psychologists, you don't think big money. He makes big money. He ended up not coming back and finishing his PhD. Last I heard, talked to him, he was in Silicon Valley making more money than I could possibly ever make as an academic. The difference was he chose a life where he had to work a 9-to-5 job. I choose a life where I don't always have to stick to punching the clock like he does. But the kinds of things he worked with the companies at Compaq was, he worked a lot with their statistics and their research. He helped to improve worker satisfaction. He went and talked to workers, surveyed the workers, studied the workers who were the most productive. He studied the workers who were the least productive, and then actually sat there and put into place protocols that helped all workers. IO psychologists are the individuals that come up to places like Google. You hear about Google and even places like Microsoft and how they're great places to work and how, they have break rooms where there's pool tables in them or video games. IO psychologists are the ones who say, let's try this to improve worker efficiency. You have a happy workplace, you typically have happy workers. You have a dull and boring workplace, you typically have dull and bored workers. So Those types of psychologists are the ones who really push that. IO stands for industrial and O stands for organizational. Industrial organizational, that's what it means. We're going out into the industrial world and we're working with organizations to improve their abilities. IO psychologists also focus on leadership. Leadership is a really key thing when you think about industry. You can have the greatest company, the greatest workers, greatest managers, but if your top leadership doesn't know what they're doing, then you're not going to succeed. You're going to fail equally. You can have different types of leadership styles that we like to look at in psychology. There's a difference between autocratic leadership and democratic leadership. Autocratic leaderships are leaders, are individuals who sit there and lead from a very authoritarian perspective, not necessarily the my way, the highway, but they're the ones who are going to make the end decision, not really listen to any input. They're going to take the company where they think is the best way to go. The other side is a democratic leader who will sit there and listen to input from their employees, from their managers, from the vice presidents, whatever your company is, listen to all the input, sift through it, and then make a decision. It's still ultimately their decision, but they still value the input. IO psychologists also work with leaders on developing worker buy-in. A plan doesn't work unless workers go in and actually buy into the plan. So if you have a new system that you're trying to implement in your company and the leader says, we're going to go this way, if workers don't buy into that and believe in it, then they're not going to follow through and it's going to fail. So IO psychologists work with leadership groups, presidents, CEOs of companies, to implement ideas and get workers to buy into it. And oftentimes it's little things like getting an employee a little bit of input into a project so that they now are invested in it. It's something that they came up with that they want to sit there and they want to do. Additionally, they work with, I've kind of mentioned already, job satisfaction, being happy with your job. We work with HR departments for training. Training is a big key a lot of times in organizations. You don't want to walk into a brand new organization and first day be thrown out into the middle of it and say, good luck, sink or swim. The sink or swim method has been proven not to be the best type of method when it comes to different type of corporations and different types of businesses. Rather, we develop training strategies. How do you introduce the marketplace to somebody? How do you introduce, the types of skills they're going to need, the types of things they're going to do on a daily basis. Not exactly their jobs, but these are the training things we need. And it also extends beyond just typical training for their work. We're also talking about trainings for things like what's the best type of seminar on legal issues that goes into a program. You don't want to sit there and have an 8-hour training session where people sit through it, bored out of their mind, and then don't take anything from it. So how do you actually develop the training session for, say, legal issues for your employees? Or if it's sexual harassment, which is kind of a big thing in the past 20 years. How do you develop a program that's not only effective, but it still keeps the people entertained so that when they leave the training seminar at the end of the day, it's something that they're interested in. One of the last really cool areas, not last, but there's 100 different areas that IO psychologists work with, is they work teams and groups. There is an inherent difference between teams and groups. Groups are made up of homogeneous individuals. In other words, they're plug and play. If you take one member out, you can put another member in. So for example, a jury would be considered a group. If you have 12 people on a jury and you have to lose somebody for various reasons and you plug somebody else in, it really doesn't affect the dynamics of the group. IO psychologists like to look at that and how that works. Are those dynamics really affected? They also like to look at teams. Teams are heterogeneous, meaning that each person on a team has a different part they play. So for example, go back to the analogy of the juries. With groups, you can plug somebody in, pull somebody out. It really doesn't affect the dynamics is what we've learned. With teams, it does affect dynamics. It affects dynamics quite a bit. So take, for instance, maybe some of y'all know a basketball team. A basketball team consists of 5 starters. If you take out the starting point guard and put in the backup point guard, the team that's on the floor is inherently changed because different skill set is being brought. Most jobs, most workers, most companies, you have a team atmosphere as opposed to a group atmosphere. So we really look at how things change. IO psychologists also focus on something known as flow, which is kind of a new area in the field. Flow, you probably heard of, is kind of getting in the zone, and how workers work with flow and get in the zone with what they're doing. How do you keep it such that when somebody's in the zone, they're working at their optimal level? How do you keep them working at an optimal level? Some of the cool research that's been out there on that now deals with something as simple as rock band. Y'all probably have heard of rock band where you play guitar, play the drums, play keyboards, whatever you play. Research has been done recently on flow and looking at how do you get somebody into that rhythm and such that they're performing at their optimal level, they're enjoying themselves, and they are performing well. Can that actually be applied to the workplace? So again, go back to the Google example I used. Google is famous for having this wonderful workplace in which they've got daycares on site, they've got a cafeteria on site, or if you want to extend it more, again, I'm a sports guy, so I'm going to extend it to ESPN. ESPN's the same way. ESPN is notorious for that too. Not notorious, famous. Notorious sounds really bad. It's famous for that too. ESPN has got its own cafeteria on site. They got different buildings. They've got a gym. They've got daycare centers. You know, not only do people do their work, but they have flexibilities to get things done that they wouldn't typically do. They don't have to leave what ESPN calls their campus to go off to eat. They don't have to leave to go work out. They don't have to leave for basic things like dry cleaning and stuff. All this stuff is provided by the company. Now, as you might be thinking is, well, that's a lot of money that they're outlaying. Well, if you have a happy worker, then you have a productive worker, and that's kind of the way they viewed it. And it's actually been a great model by which large companies, big companies that are making money in the world are actually extending their abilities. One of the big areas that IO psychologists work in is motivation. How do you keep people motivated? You know, we talked about worker satisfaction, but how do you get somebody motivated? The best work that we do as humans, as people, is whenever we are intrinsically motivated, meaning the motivation is from within. Take a writer, for example. Writers sit there and write books, and you know, the writer writes their first book, and it's this great novel, and they're all into it, and they get it published. They're intrinsically motivated to write the book because it's something that's important to them. IO psychologists want to take that and put it in the workplace. They don't want people only being extrinsically motivated. And what do I mean by extrinsic? Well, extrinsic means that you are externally motivated. We are all extrinsically motivated to go to our work, to go to our jobs. Some of you probably have careers, some of you probably have jobs. Take, for example, the 17-year-old who goes and works at McDonald's. Why are they working at McDonald's? Well, the end game for them to work at McDonald's is because they're wanting to make money. That's extrinsic motivation. IO psychologists want to take that love for doing the job and placing it into the job itself. So, for example, the person who wrote the book, they write that first book, they're intrinsically motivated, they're all gung-ho for it, they get it published, their publishing company gives them an advance of $500,000 to write the second book, and what happens? Well, you probably said it by now, they run into writer's block. They can't write the second book because things have changed. No longer are they intrinsically motivated to do their job in this case. They become extrinsically motivated, meaning they're trying to write the book because they have money out there. We all are going to work in organizations. We're all going to work in some type of structure. Maybe it's going to be academics, maybe it's going to be the public sector, maybe it's going to be the private sector. Who knows? But at some point, you're going to need to be intrinsically motivated, hopefully are intrinsically motivated to do what you do. It's the idea of, can we get people motivated to do their jobs? Yes, there's extrinsic rewards, but can we get them to do it because they love to do it? So for myself, example, I mentioned earlier in the tape that I've got some training in IO psychology. I could be making more money if I wasn't in academics. However, I'm not intrinsically motivated when I'm not in academics. Money is not necessarily the big motivating factor. How do you place that into a worker in a job? It's really hard to do. Different jobs have different intrinsic motivators. You know, you can sit there and give people bonuses. If you sell X number of widgets, which is just kind of just a generic term there, of a product, then we will give you a bonus. Well, that's an extrinsic motivation. You're externally motivated to reach that point. As an IO psychologist, I want to see, can I get you to be intrinsically motivated? In other words, can you beat your goal from last month? Okay? Or can I inspire you to sit there and beat your personal best? Go back to sports teams, go to runners, for example. People who run, we don't always understand them, but they like to run, and they run a lot. Why? Because they like to beat their time. They're not running against people they're tracing against, they're trying to beat it. That's an intrinsic motivation. If I'm trying to beat somebody else, now I'm extrinsically motivated. So the idea with IO psychologists is we also try to bring motivation into the factor. How do you keep people motivated? Especially if you have low morale, or you run into something like we did a few years ago with the recession. How do you keep people going in their jobs and being productive? You don't want to have a situation where you have 8 people coming in to a career on a shift to say, again, go back to McDonald's, and they're only there because they want a paycheck. It's not going to provide, 1, good company morale, 2, it's not going to provide good customer service, which is also a big area with IO psychology. How do you provide the best customer service? Well, if you have happy, motivated employees, then you will be able to provide that type of thing. The last kind of area that I want to work on is hiring. Hiring is also an area that IO psychologists work with. Hiring is really a different beast. We talked about HR departments earlier and how I mentioned that IO psychologists are heavily involved. When we hire somebody, oftentimes we've already made a decision who we're going to hire in our heads, whether we know it or not. You set out a list, you have a call, you send in your resume, I'm sure you've all done this at some point, into a company. When you go in for the job interview itself is really a personality test. At that point, they already know not everything, but pretty much everything they need to know about you from your resume, from your academic career, from your work experience, from maybe your service, anything that's correlated to the particular job that you are applying for. IO psychologists try to work and streamline that hiring process so that it's not only effective, but it's also efficient. If you have 100 applicants and we have criteria that are X, Y, and Z, and 99 of them meet X, Y, and Z, and somebody doesn't, IO psychologists would tell you to put aside the person that doesn't because they didn't meet the criteria you need. A lot of times in businesses, somebody might still consider that individual. Oh, well, it's a buddy of mine's friend, sister, brother, whatever. IO psychologists really push for that. Not only that, then they also work with the interview process. How is the interview process going to work the best such that you, as an employer, can figure out if the soon or potential employee is going to be a good fit in your company? What type of questions should you ask? Are we actually following the right procedures? So the IO psychologists work with the hiring departments and HR departments to really work on those types of things. The thing I want to really wrap up with you today is the idea of this is a different area. If you're not interested in business at all, not necessarily the area you want to be in. Not that you can't apply it, but you would be surprised. Most of you are first-time college students, freshmen, maybe sophomores, but basically this is an introductory class, so you're learning about a number of different areas. I know you've heard about a couple already. The idea with IO psychology is if you're in psychology to make money, this is the particular subdiscipline that you really want to go into. It's the best one as far as making money. There's a shortage in the country with IO psychologists. However, if you don't want to work with businesses, this is not the best way for you to go. It's just not. I mean, the focus is working with businesses. Or, even though I spend a lot of time in businesses, IO psychologists also work with the government a lot to help the government out, especially things like the military, the Army Research Institute, the Air Force, the DOD. They work with the military too to help with same types of problems we talked about: leadership, motivation, job satisfaction. Because at the end of the day, the military in a lot of ways is a corporation. When you think about it, you have different ranks, which could signify different levels of employment, and you have leaders who have to make decisions and so forth and so on. The idea here is that IO psychologists really apply the tools that they learn in psychology, the research skills, the attitudes and behaviors, and how to assess them and how to assess opinions, and how to actually take that and apply it to real world problems. A lot of the different sub-disciplines or concentrations in psychology don't necessarily apply it to real world problems. IO does. It's an offshoot of the social psychologist and the things that they've learned, but it's actually an applied world. All the other areas, I'll even use clinical psych, cognitive, social, developmental, very theoretical, somewhat applied, but IO psychology actually takes the tools that you learn in psychology and applies them to everyday real world problems. Like I said, that's why you see them in large corporations such as Google, Microsoft, Intel, Johnson & Johnson, DuPont, Oracle, you name it. All these different companies hire IO psychologists. If you have any questions, I'm sure you could talk to the instructor of the course. If you want to have more further questions about this particular thing, you can find my information on the website under the Justice Studies Department. And I'd just like to thank you for your time and listening today.